So welcome for those of you for whom it's the first day, and welcome back for those of you who've been in the conference since the beginning. So the panel today is entitled Representing Precarity, and I will introduce the first speaker, Corinne Duboin. Corinne Duboin is Professor of African American and Post-Colonial Literatures in the Department of English Studies at the University of Réunion Island, France. Her research interests include contemporary migrant and diasporic literature and Black women's writing. She has published articles in the CLA Journal, Mississippi Quarterly, Obsidian, the Savin Literary Journal, Commonwealth, Études caribéennes, Études littéraires africaines, and other journals. Her most recent book, co-edited with Marcus Arnold and Judith, ici présente, is Borders and Ecotones in the Indian Ocean, Cultural and Literary Perspectives in 2020. I will also say something very personal. So I've known Corinne for such a long number of years, and she's been, a really close partner in everything that I've been doing. So Corinne will speak about migrant deaths, borderscapes, and Necropolitics in Edwidge Danticat's non-fiction.
Okay, well, thank you, Claudine. So, is it okay? Yeah, okay. Edwidge Danticat's eclectic literary production sheds light on the tormented history of Haiti and its American-based diaspora. It is also a militant work that resonates with the current global concerns such as migration issues and recent debates on structural violence and systemic racism in both authoritarian regimes and neoliberal democracies. As an immigrant artist at work, Danticat feels that she must, quote, quantify the price of the American dream in flesh and bone. She thereby claims her social responsibility as a Haitian American writer to expose the genealogy of sufferings connected with a long history of displacements and border crossings. She focuses on the corporality of life and death with the figure of the post-colonial migrant and the human as a biopolitical subject reduced to matter. In my presentation, I will therefore adopt a transversal approach to her works of fiction and non-fiction in which aesthetics, ethics, and politics intersect. I will examine Danticat's representation of dying, missing, or dead migrant bodies and their forced mobilities or immobilities resulting from necropolitical practices. I'll explore how the author depicts borderscapes and heterotopic spaces that entrap Haitian migrants, exclude them, and endanger their lives away from home. The theme of death runs through Danticat's work, often in relation to migration. The author reconfigures the controlled striated spaces migrants attempt to cross both on land and at sea. She evokes personal experiences and traumatic historical events such as the Parsley Massacre of October 1937, that is to say the mass killing of Haitians living in the Dominican Republic at the border with Haiti, ordered by dictator Rafael Trujillo, or the perilous odysseys of many Haitian boat people. She reconsiders the grid of impassable borderlines drawn on the geopolitical map of an ensemble of fluid borderscapes, porous zones of interaction that may lead to global flows and turbulences. In that sense, national borders become transitional areas of asymmetrical power relations. Writing from the perspective of Haitian migrants, Danticat exposes the tensions that arise from those problematic conflictual borderscapes as in-between spaces that leave migrants in limbo and breed multiple forms of violence resulting in deaths. Danticat brings into question the geopolitical distribution of corporal vulnerability, to use Butler's phrase. She represents these borderscapes that blur the lines between hope and despair, safety and danger, life and death, as gray zones of indistinction between humanity and inhumanity, between biological and political bodies. The author illustrates how liminal spaces such as river borders, seas, beaches, or enclosed places such as boats, detention centers, or burial sites, where the helpless migrants are stripped of their rights and status, of their identity and dignity, eventually produce bare life as formulated by Agamben. Using Bembe's theory of necropolitics as a framework to examine what he calls contemporary forms of subjugation of life to the power of death, we'll see how Danticat throws light upon the plight of Haitian migrants whose bodies and lives are under the control of sovereign necro-powers on both sides of the water. Indeed, taken as a whole, Danticat's works delineate a continuum between past and present realities, the intersections of different forms of domination, hierarchy, and vulnerability in both Haiti and more broadly the island of Hispaniola, and the USA that have forced many migrants into a deadly impasse. She notably underscores the correlations between Trujillo's or Haiti's successive regimes of terror and the colonial plantation systems. These powers have been built on a society fragmented along social and racial barriers that produce the precarity of Black lives. As Bembe puts it, under such necro-powers, quote, sovereignty means the capacity to define who matters and who does not, who is disposable and who is not. In a short story in 1937, Josephine, the narrator, tells how her mother escaped Trujillo's ethnic cleansing by crossing the river to reach Haiti, leaving her own mother behind. Quote, from the Haitian side of the river, she could still see the soldiers chopping up her mother's body and throwing it into the river, along with many others. The Massacre River and its banks became a singular death space where multiple borders merged. More than a liquid state border, the river became a racialized border as the dictator's henchmen determined who could cross and who could not along ethnic lines. We can thus read Haitians' black bodies as borders, the body being then, to borrow from Bembe, the moving body of undesired masses of populations, unquote. Not to mention the language border between Hispanics and Creole speakers who were easily identified as Haitians and subsequently killed for mispronouncing perejil, parsley in Spanish. Josephine comes to the following conclusion, quote, we were the daughters of that river, which had taken our mothers from us. We came from the bottom of the river where the blood never stops flowing. The river was the place where it had all begun, unquote. Besides, in the novel The Farming of Bones, Danticat's character Amabel, who survived the carnage, believes that Haiti's history is more like flesh than air, a statement that recalls Horton Spiller's distinction between the controlled captive body and the flesh of Black slaves, whose wounds and scars were the reminders of the violent history. Before the body, there is the flesh, Spiller writes, as a primary narrative. The inaugural border crossing under duress, swimming across the river, sailing across the Atlantic on a slave ship, is the traumatic starting point of a legacy, a history of migration inscribed on the Black body. It is in its very mutilated flesh. In the same vein, two of Danticat's short stories are dedicated to Haitian migrants who have fled their country and attempt to reach the American shores on rickety boats. Children of the Sea, published in 1998 and written in epistolary form, portrays a young girl in violent-ridden Haiti, separated from her boyfriend who escaped with other passengers on a leaky boat heading to Florida. The author associates the migrants' deadly crossing of the sea with the Middle Passage, the traumatic voyage of their uprooted African ancestors who perished on their way to America and whose bones lie at the bottom of the sea. The migrants' drifting boat that first meant resistance, escape, and survival, and that will eventually sink, turns into a deadly trap at a site of chaos in the middle of the sea, just like Haiti, pictured as an island adrift. The main narrator describes the extremely harsh and humiliating conditions on his unsafe journey, alluding to the repetition of the painful history that has continuously robbed black men and women of their human dignity and that has reduced them to material or biological bodies in bondage. Quote, "Do you want to know how people go to the bathroom on the boat? Probably the same way they did on those slave ships years ago. I am always embarrassed by the smell. It is demeaning to have to squat in front of so many people. People turn away, but not always," unquote. On the island, his girlfriend explains that on one night, as some Makoots were torturing their neighbors, her father hid his family, fearing for their own lives. Quote, "Papa had us tiptoe from the house into the latrine out back. I thought I was going to choke on the smell of rotting poo-poo," unquote. The author uses scatological imagery to evoke degrading intrusions on bodily privacy and atrocities entailed by a brutal masculinist necropower. She constructs the island and the boat as parallel abject spaces of filth, decay, putrefaction, and death. The overloaded craft, similar to Glissant's open boat, is, as Glissant says, a womb, a matrix that expels. It is pregnant with as many dead as living under sentence of death, unquote. Symbolically enough, 15-year-old Céliane, who's pregnant after being raped by a Makoot, delivers a stillborn baby girl on board. Quote, "I have moved to the other side of the boat, so I will not have to look inside, Céliane. People are always watching," says the narrator, who later keeps thinking, quote, "They have thrown every piece of flesh that followed the child out of her body into the water. They're going to throw the dead baby in the water. When these things attract sharks, after Céliane threw her baby's corpse overboard, jumped into the water and drowned, he wrote down in his notebook, 'The sea is that spot, in that spot is like the sharks that live there. It has no mercy,' unquote. The author also uses similar animal metaphors to describe both the ruthless militia and the boat people, the perpetrators of violence and their victims. They're all compared to dogs and vultures, repulsive scavengers. Danticat's bestiary evokes dehumanization, physical danger, predation, revulsion, and death. As the boat keeps leaking, the narrator writes down, quote, "I'm scared to think what would happen if we had to choose among ourselves who would stay on the boat and who should die. Given the choice to make a decision like that, we would act like vultures, including me," unquote. Danticat's depiction of boat people gradually plunging into horror and fear, feeling both shame and disgust, exemplifies how, under extreme circumstances of survival, human beings may easily cross the line and fall into abjection, and are led to reproduce the very system of oppression that victimized them and which they have fled. Bodily waste, fluids and excrements, the placenta, the matrix of life, the corpses, all thrown overboard, are organic matter and flesh that will feed the sharks. They evoke abjection, the need to expel, to put at a distance what the survivors refuse to face and identify with: indignity, precarious lives, disposable bodies, human waste. These disturbing images bring to mind Kristeva's definition of the abject in Powers of Horror. Quote, "Refuse and corpses show me what I permanently thrust aside in order to live. These body fluids, this defilement, this shit are what life withstands, hardly and with difficulty on the part of death. There I am at the border of my condition as a living being. The corpse, seen without God and outside of science, is the utmost of abjection. It is death infecting life, abject," unquote. In her more recent short story, Without Inspection, published in 2019, Danticat pictures the torments of illegal migrants who managed to reach American shores alive, while their less fortunate companions had died, their bodies lost at sea, washed up on the beach. As Kluvik and Richer put it, quote, "The beach is a contradictory and unstable signifier. It can offer regeneration, pleasure and shelter, but it can also appear as a place of segregation and as a closed border. Danticat depicts the sunny beaches of Miami as sites of many dangers and uncertainties for vulnerable migrants in hospitable borders under surveillance, with the presence of the police, quote, with their helicopters, cruisers, ambulances, and dogs, cadaver dogs, released on the beach to find corpses that might be hidden from view, end quote. The beach turned into a graveyard signifies death at the border and death as the border. The successive waves of Haitian migrants escaping poverty and political violence have been continuously perceived by US authorities and governments as threats to socio-economic stability and national security. Reforms in US immigration policies, especially in the post-9/11 era, have reinforced restrictions and controls at the border and beyond, along the coast and in territorial or international waters, if not in Haiti itself, thus strengthening American interventionist policies that violate Haitians' freedom of movement. The US thus expands its national borders, rebordering a globalized world and pushing back unwanted, stigmatized Haitian incomers. Those who are intercepted are sent to temporary detention centers or held in hotel rooms before deportation. Thus, these facilities, located inland, contribute to the emergence of new interior borderscapes of transit, confinement, and exclusion. In her memoir, Brother I'm Dying, Danticat relates the appalling circumstances of her uncle's death in 2004. Joseph Danticat, an 81-year-old minister living in Haiti, had received death threats from a street gang. He thus fled to the US with his elder son and asked for temporary asylum. They were consequently held in custody at the airport and transferred in shackles to Chrome Detention Center in South Miami. While he was interviewed by an officer, Danticat's uncle, who had been separated from his son, left without his medication, who was exhausted, in pain and under stress, and who had to use an electronic voice box to speak as a result from cancer, had a particularly violent seizure, started vomiting and urinated on himself. However, the medic persistently repeated that the elderly man was faking. Though his condition was life-threatening, Joseph Danticat had to wait long hours to be eventually transferred to hospital. Too weak to speak and to sign his name in the on the admission form and registered as alien number 270419999, he turned into a silenced, invisible, and insignificant man whose life didn't count as human. He passed away in the hospital's prison ward shortly after. Fearing for his life in Haiti and seeking refuge in America, Joseph Danticat, who was yet denied entry to the USA, was caught in between two countries and made to die homeless in a no-man's land that, as Danticat says, meant nothing less than humiliation and suffering. In her memoir, the author, who was deeply affected by her uncle's nightmarish ordeal, weaves together her moving evocation of her uncle's agony and passages from the reports she officially requested, detailing her uncle's detention and his medical examination in an impersonal, factual way. The blatant contrast between the two perspectives serves the author's devastating indictment of the bureaucratic management of undocumented migrants and refugees by inflexible officers devoid of the slightest empathy. Danticat also points out the unethical behavior of the medical staff who is supposed to save lives and not let die. She puts into question US immigration policies and decries a necropolitical machinery that discriminates and racializes Haitian migrants. Quote, "Was my uncle going to jail because he was Haitian? If he were white, Cuban, anything other than Haitian, would he have been going to Chrome?" Unquote. Edwidge Danticat repeatedly denounces the criminalization of migrants treated as prisoners who are deprived of their basic rights and fall victim to acts of physical and psychological violence resulting in preventable deaths. In her essay entitled no greater shame. She narrates her 2003 visit with some journalists and activists to a hotel where several Haitian women and children were jailed. As the delegation insisted on the deplorable detention conditions that affected the physical and mental health of the uncared for migrants, the guard on duty answered plainly, quote, "I'm just doing my job. If you have questions or concerns, speak to my boss. It is hard for me to tell who her boss is. Is it the tall woman we met early at Chrome? Is it the US Attorney General John Ashcroft? Tom Ridge, head of Homestead Security? President George W. Bush himself? Or is it ultimately me, the taxpayer? Are my hard-earned dollars contributing to this, the detention of my own?" End quote. Here again, as a committed citizen, the writer denounces structural violence, the systemic racist and xenophobic biases of the American administration, whose agents are not held morally and legally responsible for the tragic consequences of their grossly negligent acts and inaction. She blames senior officials, state legislators, and the political executive power for their unspoken complicity, for the legitimization and legalization of brutal, destructive policies that lead to migrant deaths. Once Joseph Danicat's corpse had been moved to a funeral home in Miami, Edwidge Danicat goes to see her uncle. Quote, "After the autopsy, a line of gray rope had been used to sew the front of his body. His tracheotomy hole was sealed. His head was also sewn down the middle from ear to ear. My uncle did not look resigned and serene like most of the dead I've seen. Perhaps it was because his lips were swollen to twice the usual size. He looked as though he had been punched. He also appeared anxious and shocked, as though he were having a horrible nightmare." End quote. Through the account of her painful, intimate confrontation with death, the vision of her uncle's remains, a biological body reduced to its materiality, the author feels that the post-mortem examination was yet another attack on his dignity as a person and an infringement on his bodily integrity. His disfigured body that had been dissected, examined, and sewn up also bears the scars of the unspeakable horror he was made to endure. Edwidge Danicat not only denounces the unethical management of Haitian migrants at the border, she also alludes to the deep fault lines that divide neoliberal America and exclude Haitian migrants who have managed to cross into the USA, together with ethnic minorities and other underprivileged segments of the population, invisible communities whose lives are neglected and whose members make up what she calls another country in Create Dangerously. Quote, "One can easily become a refugee within one's own borders because one's perceived usefulness and precarious citizenship are always in question, whether in Haiti or in that other America." End quote. Through her writings, Danicat indicates that despite the apparent global north-south divide, state brutalism also characterizes America's capitalist political system. Mbembe's recent concept of brutalism, developed in his book Brutalisme in 2020, borrowed from architecture and applied to politics, can be understood as, quote, "a forcing of bodies which are treated as concrete, subjecting them to a combination of pressures. Brutalism is the program that consists of reducing all that exists to the category of objects and matter, integrated into the sphere of calculation." End quote. Along this line of thought, Mbembe argues that power, quote, "needs paste, concrete, cement, mortar, beams, crushing stones, lead, steel, and bodies made of bones, flesh, blood, muscles, nerves. Demolishing is indeed a gigantic task. The practices of demolition, tearing down, breaking into pieces, and crushing are at the heart of brutalism in its political sense." So this is my translation from his book, Brutalisme. I believe that Danicat shares Mbembe's vision on political and global economic systems that brutalize individuals in particular migrants, a view she expresses figuratively through Arnold's tragic story in Without Inspection, his fatal fall from a 48-story building, a luxury hotel he was helping to erect, she says, into an open cement mixer chute attached to the truck. So I'll quote some passages, the description of that fall. His free fall ended when his body slammed into the drum of a cement mixer. He was being tossed inside a dark blender full of grout. Every few seconds, his face would emerge from under the wet, pounded pebbles. He pretended that he was swimming and tried to flutter kick, just like he had when the speedboat stopped in the middle of the ocean and he was told to swim ashore. He felt lighter now. His bones were melting, his blood evaporating. He hadn't noticed that there were streaks of blood polluting the cement, or that he was feeling no pain. Then he heard the sirens, which took him back to the beach, to the grey sand of Darwin's sable face. He realized that he was dying. Arnold, an undocumented immigrant working on the construction site, is emblematic of a disposable, unpaid workforce living in a permanent state of injury. His symbolic death in the cement mixer signifies the exploitation of both raw material and human resources, matter and bodies, the crushing or destruction of migrants, their physical and social death, in the name of production for consumption and profit. Tossed and hurt in his flesh, bleeding to death, Arnold associates cement with seawater and sand. His final fight for life reminds him of his perilous crossing. The conflation of liquid elements, cement, water, sand too, is suggestive of the precarity of his existence as a migrant. Besides, while Arnold, as a living man, was made invisible in America, he suddenly gains hyper-visibility as a dying man through the media. Quote, there were cell phone videos of him falling, taken from different angles. He looked not like a person, but like a large object plummeting. He was moving too fast to be identified as a human being when the footage wasn't in slow motion. End quote. His image circulating on social media is a macabre spectacularization of his black body in pain, seen from afar as a formless object, as matter with no substance. It is the visible sign of his social invisibility. To conclude, as a writer, Danticat voices her concerns and raises ethical and political questions about the plight of Haitian migrants seeking safety and facing death. Through a wide range of books, she traces the many layers of Haiti's migratory history, an unrecorded history of intimate emotions and indignities. Writing about migrant deaths and wasted lives is not only a way for her to denounce brutal policies and systemic racial barriers, it is also a work of memory and mourning. In her essay, The Art of Death, Writing the Final Story, she states that we write about the dead to make sense of our losses, to become less haunted, to turn ghosts into words, to transform an absence into language. Thank you.
So thank you, Corinne, for this analysis of Danticat's writing in the grid through Kristeva and Membe. So the next, we'll take questions. We'll take questions at the end. The next speaker is Pilar Cuder-Dominguez from Spain. So Pilar Cuder-Dominguez is full professor in the Department of English at the University of Huelva, Spain. Her research interests are the intersections of gender, genre, nation, and race. She is the author of 3 books and co-editor of 8 collections of essays. Her latest publications have discussed the work of writers of Black and Asian ancestry in the UK and Canada. She is currently lead investigator of the research project Bodies in Transit 2, and team member of the international project Thanatic Ethics, the circulation of bodies in migratory spaces. So Pilar's talk today is entitled A Thanatic Genre, Crime Fiction and Refugee Vulnerability in Ausma, Zehanat Khan.
Thank you, Claudine. Thank you. So this is work that I have developed, as Claudine has said. Can you hear me well? No?
Yeah, it has to be really
Just I
close
have too much equipment here. But I left my hard copy of my paper at home, so this is how I can deal with it. Can you hear me well now, Bine? Yeah? Thank you. So this is work that I have developed within the project Bodies in Transit 2 in conjunction with Thanatic Ethics. Now I'm going to be talking about crime fiction and the interface with refugee studies and migration studies. So I'm going to start by discussing some general ideas about the place of the arts or the place that crime fiction may, the role that it may play within or in conjunction with refugee studies. And then I will move on to my case study on Kang's work. So crime fiction hinges on a breach of the social order that the intervention of a detective is aimed to correct, thereby generating in readers feelings of satisfaction and meeting our very human need to feel safe. Thus, crime fiction simultaneously caters for our vicarious thirst for adventure and acknowledges our fear of death. The means of the resolution, whether it's by trial, by the criminal's accidental death, or maybe a vigilante's execution, is extremely significant in terms of how each author positions themselves in terms of the social structures that they are working within. These structures are mostly national ones as crime fiction, and particularly the kind of subgenre that I'm going to be discussing here, which is police procedurals, is grounded in a nation-state judicial system. So international human rights usually remain beyond its bounds. Yet this is a field explored since 2015 by Ausma Zehanat, Khan's series of mysteries led by two Canadian police officers, Esa Katak and Rachel Getty. Kang, who holds a PhD in international human rights and is a former adjunct law professor, targets in each of her novels international failures to protect human rights, usually in combination with an individual breach of the social order, which is the proper mandate of crime fiction. Her first work, as you can see there, The Unquiet Death, tackled the legacy of the Balkan War. The second one, The Language of Secrets, in it the detectives had to stop a terror attack in Toronto. The third moved to Iran, and the fourth, A Dangerous Crossing, or in the US title, No Place of Refuge, which is the one I'm going to discuss, is set on the island of Lesbos in Greece. And the fifth and last in the series so far, A Deadly Divide, returns to Canada, this time to Quebec, and here the terror attack is mixed up with complex questions relating to Quebecois separatism. Okay. So working this way at the intersection between human rights and the crime narrative, Khan's mysteries use the latter to critique the former. Consequently, I argue here that her fiction consistently exerts what Pezzani and Heller have described as a disobedient gaze. This disobedient gaze is cast on ongoing human rights violations in the Mediterranean. Sorry, it should be here. Pezzani and Heller describe this disobedient case as one that aims not to disclose what the regime of migration management attempts to unveil, but what it attempts to hide, the political violence it is founded on, and the human rights violations that are its structural outcome. Thus, although at first sight, Khan's A Dangerous Crossing appears to follow crime fiction conventions in the search for the criminal, its larger mandate is to explore the plight of those caught between the borders of nation states and without access to further mobility. Mostly, but not exclusively, as you know, Syrian nationals stranded on the shores of Turkey and Greece reached after escaping at considerable risk the dictatorial regime of Bashar al-Assad and their ravaged homes, their war-ravaged homes. The novel, as I have already mentioned, was published in the United States under the equally significant title, No Place of Refuge. So it unveils the extreme vulnerability of this population in the context of the much wider violence and general non-assistance policies carried out by European border management actors throughout the Mediterranean, an area that was described by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in 2011 as the most deadly stretch of water for refugees and migrants. My main argument is that A Dangerous Crossing makes a powerful critique of the failure of European states and transnational institutions to morally respond to the needs of the population whose vulnerability is context-specific, but through the negligence and shortcomings of those official agencies actually borders on what Mackenzie, Rogers, and Dodds have termed pathogenic vulnerability, resulting from, they say, quote, social policy interventions aimed to ameliorate inherent or situational vulnerability that have the contradictory effect of increasing vulnerability, unquote. In that sense, the Mediterranean refugee crisis represented in the novel can serve to illuminate the complex materiality of vulnerability in migratory contexts closely connected to Fortress Europe policies. Between roughly 2014 and 2019, the strict border management carried out within the European Union was thrown into disarray due to the massive arrival of refugees. The arts have not remained indifferent to this prolonged humanitarian crisis, or rather series of crises. Many examples have been given here, so I'm not going to repeat them. But all of these artistic endeavors ultimately bring home Judith Butler's often quoted statement about the differential grievability that you have there on the quote, the unequal grievability, what counts as a livable life and a grievable death, she claims. Literature and the visual arts have the power to represent precisely who is or who is not normatively human, and to make visible the logics of inclusion and exclusion undergirding the concept of the human in human rights. As Nayar contends, quote, cultural discourses and their texts in many media forms and genres tell stories of what it means to be human or to be denied humanity, unquote. Not surprisingly, a remarkable number of novels and films since the 1990s have engaged in the portrayal of these tensions between the nation state and the forced migrant. In Canada, one could mention throughout the early 2000s, Dion Brandt's What We All Long For, Kim Thuy's Rue, Kim Etchling's The Disappeared, Wade Compton's The Outer Harbor, and Sharon Ballard's The Boat People, which was discussed here yesterday, to name but a few, published around the same time, the same dates of Cannes' book release. A veritable explosion of scholarly interest in these works has followed, although to be fair, the literary and imagination has for a much longer time addressed the notion of the human and of human rights. It is telling, I think, that two major academic presses in English, Cambridge University Press and Routledge, have made available companion books of essays on this subject lately. Together with that substantial outpouring of critical writing on what is variously called the refugee novel or human rights fiction, this attests to the growth of both public and scholarly interest in what has undoubtedly become a solid and highly productive interdisciplinary field, just like this conference. However, crime fiction is not usually included in these studies, despite the genre's power, as Bayer argues, to educate readers and deliver social and cultural critique on compelling and urgent topical issues of its time. These are her words. Charlotte Bayer's very interesting account of the intersection of migration and crime writing maps out how the latter has picked up highly politicized themes such as human trafficking or modern slavery, and how its generic conventions allow it to probe into the hidden face of migration. Cutting, she says, her words, through simplistic political and media discourses and revealing the complex and often horrendous realities behind the stereotypes, unquote. This is very much the case, I would argue, of Ausma's Zehanat, Khan's A Dangerous Crossing, in which the author displays a wide knowledge of the situation of displaced Syrians on Eastern Mediterranean shores. The poor living conditions in the camps, the brutality, the violence, the exploitation that seem to be part and parcel with the refugee condition were all comprehensively researched by the Canadian author, as the author's note at the end of the book makes clear. There, Khan concisely reports the main events and consequences of the Syrian war at the time of writing the book, which is approximately the autumn of 2017, including a death toll of 500,000 people and a displacement of 11 million more, 6 of them internally. She also sets down some of the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the key players in the conflict, the dictatorial regime of Bashar al-Assad and the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. A further 2-page recommended reading section allows concerned readers to contrast her facts with a considerable number of books and international human rights agencies' reports, such as Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch. Moreover, in the acknowledgements, Khan claims to have conducted interviews with war refugees, with government and NGOs, employees, journalists, lawyers, volunteers, etc., to better understand the different aspects involved in the subject. In other words, she did a lot of research for this novel. The novel's point of entry rests on the work of an NGO, a fictional NGO, called Woman to Woman, established by police officer Essa Katak's sister and by their longtime friend Audrey Clare, who's gone missing during a visit to Lesbos, where the NGO had been operating for a year. On top of the disappearance, an Interpol officer and a young male refugee have been found dead. So there's death here, finally. Shot with Audrey's gun. And the NGO staff member in Lesbos, a former refugee herself, has been detained by Interpol. So this is the crime that they need to solve. It's a whole mess, and the detective is involved both personally and politically. Khan's critique of current migration management policies in Europe targets the sharp increase of refugee camps on its borders. Although originally designed as an emergency solution in extraordinary circumstances, they have now become the rule. And this paradox was pinned down by Hannah Arendt decades ago in The Origins of Totalitarianism, as you can see in the quote. A Dangerous Crossing depicts through the eyes of Khan's Canadian detectives 3 of these camps in Greece, 2 on Lesbos and 1 on Chios, and a 4th in Turkey, throwing into relief their numerous health and sanitation problems. The portrayal of those who do not have the right to have rights dwells on the pitiful conditions and general abandonment and dehumanization of the camps. So the first thing the detective notices is precisely what you can see on the quote. The first thing Essa noticed was a concrete barrier painted over with slogans that read like cries of despair. No borders, no borders, no borders, the prayers of the stateless, unquote. Furthermore, the refugee camp is rendered here along the lines of Eleni Kondoroti's description of a site of stasis that runs counter to the refugees' pull to flight and movement. The camp stands out for its atemporality. Time has stopped here, leaving refugees' lives suspended, or what Wang described as lives on hold in yesterday's paper. A generation was losing, this is again from the novel, a generation was losing its childhood. 6,000 children were trapped on Chios without access to education or adequate health care. All around the camps were groups of people, young and old, with no occupation, no chance of earning a livelihood, unable to return, unable to move on. The camps were not a permanent solution, yet no other solution had been proffered, unquote. Stranded between borders, these persons are left in a state of extreme vulnerability, not only in terms of their mental or physical health, but insofar as they are sitting targets for many sources of violence. Verbal violence is widely spread. In the media, the language of hate is used to describe them as hordes, as an invasion or a flood. Physical violence is often random, but also occasionally organized by neo-Nazi groups like the Greek Party Golden Dawn, which in the novel assaults a Suda camp, hurling stones at the residents and torching their tents in the middle of the night. Again, as you can see, there's a very thin layer of fiction here. These are all real events. Asylum seekers are also vulnerable to the exploitation of profiteers that promise to take them to safety, rings of smugglers who make their fortunes of people's despair. Consequently, the detectives uncover a well-oiled machinery thriving on desperation that organizes routes to get refugees across without regard for their safety, with an eye only on their own profits. One of its most cruel scams, as the detectives find out, consists of making and selling counterfeit life jackets that afford refugees a sense of safety on the overcrowded boats, yet cause their drowning or their strangulation because they're hydrophilic and become a heavy weight around the neck. In addition, the migrants are subject to a double condition: vulnerability as to themselves and risk as perceived by the host community. Gender further intervenes in this condition, emphasizing female vulnerability and male risk. Such differential treatment is rendered visible on several occasions. For example, one of the quotes you have there is from a seasoned diplomat, remarking that boys on the verge of manhood are considered, she said, the most dangerous creature in the world. There is no refuge for these boys. And similarly, a young refugee perceptively sees himself through the eyes of the locals. Quote, people were no longer seeing the boy Ali in love with the girl Isra. They saw a young man on the prowl, a predator who might strike, who needed to be contained. Kindness had become happenstance, too illusory to be prized, unquote. As a result, young men traveling alone are lost to qualify for visas and resettlement. They remain the undesirables. Similarly, female vulnerability is proportionately enhanced during transit, particularly for minors. The website of Missing Children Europe, the European Federation for Missing and Sexually Exploited Children, which is mentioned several times by Kang in the novel, reports that tens of thousands of children in migration continue to go missing, to which the author adds that a disproportionate number of them are missing from the Turkish coast in particular. Let me remind you at this point, in case you have forgotten with all this information, that the central mystery that the Canadian detectives are meant to unravel is the disappearance of a Canadian white woman, Audrey Clare. But this is in turn tangled up with the disappearance of a Syrian refugee girl, Isra. Kant's assessment of the differential value of these two women calls attention to the biopolitical economy of the disposable, with its entailing categories of gender, race, faith. The crime narrative thus opens up a space to unveil the often horrific forms of migrant exploitation that seldom reach the media. Refugee camps are notoriously unsafe places for girls and women, and sexual violence is much too often involved. However, the latter categories also weigh heavily against the refugees in this novel because they are brown-skinned or dark-skinned Muslims, and so within the global economies of fear since September 11, they are cause for apprehension to Western eyes. And yet, it seems to me that the narrative presents them from the detective's point of view as what they truly are, children. On one occasion, some boys invited Katak to join in their game, to everyone's delight, and this is told from the perspective of the white female detective, Rachel, who's of Irish background. Rachel had seen another side to Katak, laughing and affectionate with children who were thrilled to find someone who spoke their tongue, someone who looked like them. They teased him mercilessly, delighted to be teased in return. This humanizing representation in the generally dehumanizing context of the refugee camp is fundamental because the detective constitutes the moral compass of the crime story, as they are the ones that identify those responsible for the crime committed. In that sense, as Pironen has argued, the detective must often balance, quote, the judicial code against the moral code in order to arrive at a just decision about the distribution of responsibility and guilt. Unquote. Thus, taking issue with Western regimes of asylum, Kant's crime narrative refuses to frame the refugee as non-human. Instead, affects towards refugees are redistributed, I think, through Katak, who is at the same time one of us and one of them. He's at the same time Western, Muslim, dark-skinned. So he is this someone who looks like them by virtue of his Pashtun background. To be fair, the shift in the characterization of the detective is not new, since crime fiction has long incorporated many different embodiments, including what has been called the ethnic or minority sleuth. Yet, in combination with the regular appeals to empathy with the refugee evenly distributed through the narrative, Katak's racialization works to generate an alternative affective economy in Sarah Ahmed's definition of those emotions that align individuals with community, quotes, through the very intensity of their attachments, unquote. In other words, Western readers, which is the primary readership of this kind of novel, are brought into a closer relationality to the refugee. And as a result, the ethnic detective becomes an instrument of the moral regime of the crime narrative, working to undo what Sullivan and Tuana have called the epistemology of ignorance, that is, those instances in which a lack of knowledge is actively produced in support of white privilege and supremacy. So in terms of a conclusion, what can I offer here? Going back to my question of, or my original question, I hope it hasn't been lost, you still remember that, the idea of is it possible for crime fiction to produce a kind of advocacy for the refugee, or is it limited by its own conventions? I have to say that this novel helps readers expand the limits of our imagination by providing a moving picture of deep vulnerabilities demanding our empathy, and by envisioning new effective economies that surpass the alienating anti-Islamic, anti-refugee language of hatred that too often reaches us via the media. This task seems quite adequate for the vehicle of crime fiction, because its central function, after all, is no other than to achieve justice for victims. In that regard, the author uses the conventions of the crime genre to mobilize our emotions towards refugees' extreme vulnerability and to strengthen our ethical and political sensibilities regarding their bare life, their death in life in the camps, outside of nation-state citizen rights. Now, what worries me, and this is like my final remark, what worries me is what kind of empathy this may be. And I think this empathy cannot be simply a kind of passive empathy that maintains those differences untouched. It has to be what Rodino Colocino calls a transformative empathy, that is one that is bridging differences by promoting listening rather than distancing or looking at speakers as others. Thank you.
So thank you, Pilar, for showing us that even something like crime fiction is political. The next speaker is Mike Lehman. Mike Lehman is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech. His research explores the potential of borders in reimagining our notions of human rights and belonging. He posits the figure of the migrant as central for an alternative understanding of literature as a site of resistance and as a way to imagine new logics of global connection. His published work examines organ trade as part of the traffic in whole and partial bodies in migration, as well as global boat migration and refugee narratives. His paper today is entitled Waste, Aesthetics and Human Rights, Remapping Human Rights from Below in Amitav Ghosh's Gun Island. Mike?
Hi. Can you hear me? I'm a bit soft-spoken, but that's what the microphone's for, right? A pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I'll just get started. So in this presentation, I will investigate a range of texts that consider refugee production, or the production of refugees by a world structured by nation states and national borders. As for method, I am using Yin Lee Espirito's term critical juxtaposing, or reading, quote, seemingly different and disconnected events, communities, histories, and spaces in order to illuminate what would otherwise not be visible about the contours, contents, and afterlives of war and empire. She's within the field of critical refugee studies. As a way toward, I explore how each text describes the use of alternative routes of migration that allied sanctioned and vectored movements. As a way toward a conclusion, I read Amitav Ghosh's recent publication, Gun Island, as a text that creates the opportunity for us to imagine the world otherwise. So currently, we imagine the world structured as lines drawn across the globe, the border operating as a place of detainment, exclusion, and expulsion. While viewing this image, I think of migration as a type of globalized game of Pong. Denying access to mobility creates dangerous, clandestine migratory routes in which the nation denies access to migrants, relegating them to the border. The denial of safe landing allows the state to violate the principle of non-refoulement, which forbids the rejection of asylum seekers from returning them to a country in which they would be in likely danger of persecution. If you never reach land, you cannot claim asylum. So nationally defined borders, rights, and protections, I suggest, lead to refugee...
I'm ridiculous, but I really cannot.
Oh, sorry. Nationally defined borders... Is it on?
No, you can move it closer to you.
So nationally defined borders, rights, and protections, I suggest, lead to refugee production and migratory flight as seen in these maps of current migration patterns. Thus, I begin with a snapshot of the present, from which I will begin the work of interrogating the exclusion of migrant populations from the rights and protections of the nation-bound citizen. Rather than viewing the border as a limit space of the nation, I aim to show that the border should be a space in which we think of a more open concept of affiliation that explores human rights from the literature and voices of the migrant and refugee. So in this image, you can see two individuals enjoying their time at the beach on a sunny afternoon. In the background, there's a migrant's body that drifted on the beach 2 hours before. The caption is telling, quote, "A couple of visitors sat under an umbrella near the corpse of a sub-Saharan immigrant who drowned after his raft sank below the beach of Sahara. The corpse was not removed for several hours, but the seasonal activity of a beach crowded with visitors continued unhindered," end quote. But the reaction of the visitors and the caption create a form of distance between the lived experience of the so-called audience and the dead body or the discarded life. So here we have two images that force us to begin to think of discarded lives. One of a child's life jacket floating in the water, the second of an art installation by Ai Weiwei of discarded life jackets organized into lotus flowers. These life jackets, in addition to shoes, fragments of clothing, all objects of debris that stand in for the human body. The world constantly comes to us in these fragments, never more so than in fragments of populations drifting, floating, and washing upon the shores and borders of the nation. The constant flow of ghostly, haunting, and deathly images of the border crossing multiply every day. This brings to the foreground the very notion of rights and protection and the status quo of the nation as a protector of human rights. Bodies floating in the sea and washing upon the beach have become described as the waste of globalization. Achille Mbembe calls them discounted bodies or, quote, bodies at the limits of life, trapped in unhospitable places, trapped human subjects, often without escape, end quote. Zygmunt Bauman likewise refers to the bodies as the waste of globalization, which he compares to traditional industrial waste. Both theorists are exploring the notion that to be, quote, alive and survive is determined by the capacity to move. Joseph Pugliese calls these bodies in space bodies of water, detailing fishermen pulling drowned migrants out of the Mediterranean Sea. With their nets, he begins to imagine our complicity in creating the so-called waste. Quote, everything here exceeds categories, borders, limits. Humans fold into marine creatures, catch of the day to be auctioned off at the markets. This is how the global south breaches the defense of Fortress Europe. Via punctured rubber dinghies and fishing nets, as necrogenic cargo, these human specters inhumed and fished defy frontiers. Served on a platter, they enter your homes to become both your alienation, and your waste. A clandestine submarine life courses through your veins, end quote. So to reiterate, a clandestine submarine life courses through our veins. The quote illustrates the dehumanization of migrants in the border space, yet the border, or the space of struggle, survival, and potentiality, displays an alternative mode of thinking. It takes the imagination as the starting point to redefine our concepts of human community through a shared complicity. Pugliese dictates the imperative to imagine otherwise. Here I ask whether the literary imaginary can draw on solidarities and communities forged in migration, depicted in literary representations of migration. So rather than the static map of the borderline shown at the beginning, can we begin to think of the border like this? Can we move from a view of the world from land, nation, boundaries, borders, to the border as an open space of possibility? The unimaginable has become the everyday, that is, the common image of the body drifting in the sea or washing upon the beach. Instead, what we cannot imagine are forms of protection and rights that do not leave the migrant at the shore of the nation. Etienne Balibar suggests that we must take the border as the space of the political itself. Other border theorists explain that present struggles surrounding the border offer the, quote, most promising conditions for the reinvention of a project of liberation, end quote. Thus, I suggest literature offers us a variety of ways for reimagining the border as creative and productive in pursuit of this liberation, a way to think from the edge. So before I move to the next part on Gun Island, I just want to make a quick note. The details of the border are gruesome examples of lives that perish, are dehumanized, turned into profit or trash. Now we'll attempt to address this tension in the next section. We must be careful not to instrumentalize the migrant and refugee, but rather explore the unease between figurations of the migrant as philosophical images or ideals and the stark reality of the lives and deaths of people. Literature exposes this tension and unease, and I suggest that thinking of the body as waste and the body parts sold to migrate forces us to consider what Homi Bhabha calls, quote, a transnational migrant knowledge, a knowledge the world desperately needs, end quote. So in May 2021, nearly 8,000 migrants crossed from Morocco to the Spanish autonomous city of Ceuta on the north coast of Africa. Images of African bodies on the beach, funerals, masses of children, and an African migrant embracing a Red Cross volunteer quickly spread across the globe with the headline, quote, death and despair on Europe's African frontier, end quote. Ceuta and Melilla, both Spanish territories in North Africa, have long been known as Europe's dirty secret, but are now celebrated as an example of how to fence off migrants, since the enclaves fall outside the Schengen area of free mobility across Europe. Indeed, 3 months prior to the May crossing, a border agent found a motionless leg inside a sealed bag of toxic ash. Upon closer inspection, the leg began moving, and a young man, quote, emerged from the ashes, end quote. After finding 4 additional migrants buried in recycling containers beneath glass bottles, some broken with sharp edges, a member of Spain's civil guard stated, quote, we'll never get used to it, end quote. And this is the point, to never get used to it. It is necessary to examine that glass bottle you bring to your recycling bin for embedded flesh. It is our constant reminder. It shows our complicity in the current migration crisis, and also begins the process of decoding national designs on who is considered protected. So yet, to view this additional photo of the woman embracing the African migrant, the focus shifts. Rather than highlighting the migrant as seen in the previous photo, this photograph highlights the Red Cross volunteer, the citizen. Luna Reyes explained, quote, he was crying. I held out my hand and he hugged me. He clung to me. That embrace was his lifeline, end quote. Here we see the problematics of migrant representation in the media. Images of lifeless bodies garner more attention and empathy than the image of the migrant that survives the crossing. Once dead, the migrant can no longer challenge the sovereignty of the nation, allowing the rights-bearing citizen to mourn the dead while maintaining their privileged position. Of Ceuta, one migrant explained, quote, all of Africa is here, end quote. Yet even with these images, and in the case of Luna, the migrant was quickly forgotten. It is unsure where he went, whether he was deported or he decided to disappear. His narrative lost, disappeared, or wasted from our collective memory. The hashtag Gracias Luna becomes a twisted, perverse joke, disappearing the dirty secrets of the global north. So published in 2019, Amitav Ghosh's Gun Island used the current migration crisis as a backdrop, highlighting increasing migration due to environmental change. The novel is intertwining narratives, including the narrator Dean, who can be considered as the kinetic elite, and who explains to the Bengali migrants that he meets in Venice, quote, "I came by plane," end quote. The other intertwining narrative is of Tipu, a seller of narratives for what he calls, quote, "the people-moving industry," end quote. In contrast to Dean's access to global mobility, Tipu migrates to Europe through a clandestine route. His occupation is explained. At this point, Tipu wasn't just talking, he was dancing like a rapper to the rhythm of his own voice, flicking his arms from side to side and stabbing the air with his reefer. Suppose a guy is applying for asylum in Sweden. He'll need a story to back him up, and it can't be just any old story. It's got to be a story they want to hear over there. Suppose the guy was starving because his land was flooded, or suppose his whole village was sick from the arsenic in their groundwater, or suppose he was being beat up by his landlord because he couldn't pay off his debts. None of that shit matters to the Swedes. Politics, religion, and sex is what they're looking for. You've got to have a story of persecution if you want them to listen to you. So that's what I can help my clients with. I give them those kinds of stories, end quote. Tipu's role as mediator of stories hints at the role of narrative in the migration industry. In fact, the stories we hear are the stories we want to know. And the novel, quote, "that shit that doesn't matter," end quote, is highlighted through the migratory process. The narrative comes after arrival for the migrant, but the migration process is a different story. Quote, what I've heard from the refugees is that the connection houses of the Sinai are equipped with special operating rooms, completely modern with all the latest equipment, including solar-powered refrigeration units. Those who can't pay the ransom are given drugs to make them senseless. Then they are taken to the operating theaters where an organ is removed, usually a kidney. Then these organs are sold, often to Europeans. I gasp. That's horrifying. I know it sounds too terrible to believe, like the worst horrors of the slave trade, end quote. The description of the connection houses as theaters of horror changes our notion of the term connection. Connection here is more in line with direct exploitation. The migrants are connected to a system of exploitation in which their body parts and narratives are sold part and parcel. The body as a resource connects the migrant to a form of waste, a recyclable object used to sustain the global north. Waste, as Dan Swanton explains, is, quote, matter out of place, end quote. The novel depicts the selling of body parts or the matter out of place to continue the migration journey, selling pieces of their body when they can no longer pay. This partial migration is better thought of departing rather than departure. Toward the end of the novel, Tipu is on his way to Italy. He travels on the blue boat across the Mediterranean. One character explains that the blue boat is a symbol of everything that's going wrong with the world: inequality, climate change, capitalism, corruption, the arms trade, the oil industry, end quote. The novel reminds us that human trafficking has always been a, quote, lucrative form of commerce, end quote. So in the image, the blue boat on the left side is from 2015. The second image of a different blue boat is 2 months ago. These bookends of Ghosh's novel show the continuation of migratory flows across the Mediterranean. In his novel, the blue boat changes from the symbol of everything that is wrong in the world to a potential site of change. The leader of the blue boat is a black woman who organized the migrants to continue the journey after exploding the connection house that was being used to harvest organs. In an improbable episode, the migrants are saved by an Italian admiral. After being questioned by the media about his decision to ignore the politicians that wish to leave the migrants at sea, he states, quote, "I have acted in accordance with the law of the sea, the law of humanity, and the law of God. If I am tried, those are the laws that I will answer to," end quote. The admiral's choice is an alternative route, one differing from clandestine routes of migration. He accepts the migrant and encourages the encounter. In a way, he depicts a way of thinking from the edge. In The World on Edge, Edward Casey invites us to, quote, think through what it means to think on it, end quote. This thinking on the edge or from the border is a way to reflect on complicity in the increasing migration across the globe. As Ghosh's novels suggest, thinking of the other forces us to ask, who are we? Like Dean, I also reflect on my own complicity, the life of migrants, and the food I consume, in the case of Puglisi's description, or the quickening global deterioration of the environment from the objects I purchase, which is also discussed in the novel quite often. So I continually consider Dean's statement that I came by plane. What the text offers as an alternative is a solidarity based on occupying the same position of the migrant to question what it means to be human. It forces the audience to think about the rights of others, to ask, who are we? Thank you. That's it. Oh, sorry.
So thank you, Mike, to help us think about representation, basically, and you know what we do with either images or images in literature also. Okay, so I want to thank the speakers actually for keeping. I mean, you were so good. I mean, we're going to have you again, I think. Okay, so we have time for questions. Yeah, I suppose, yes. Yeah. At the back of the room.
There's two microphones here.
Yeah.
Maybe we can bring them close to them. Just one.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you all for these very insightful papers. I took lots of notes, but my comment, rather than a question, is for Pilar. I'm a great fan of crime fiction. I'm not familiar with the author you focused on, but I was wondering. You focused on, from what I understood, of course, an author that thematizes refugees' vulnerability. But have you considered, this is just a comment, have you seen the latest Poirot, I think it's the latest, by Malkovich, and performed by Malkovich, and how this canonical crime fiction is being adapted to force the perspective of the refugee, for example, in this case, Poirot as the refugee. So in a way, I think this speaks to, when you quoted from Charlotte Beyer, on how crime fiction is being used also to create this empathy. You turn transformative empathy, and not only through the thematizing of the ethnic, as you mentioned, detective, but in this case, making Poirot also the ethnic or the refugee detective. But basically, it's but it's Sarah Phelps' adaptation of the Agatha Christie's novels has been doing this. So thank you.
Thank you, Ana Cristina. No, I haven't watched it yet, sorry. But yeah, since the 1980s, approximately, the kind of detective we have has changed, and they have changed radically. First, there were women detectives, then there's ethnic detectives, and now there's like refugee detectives. I think the problem here is the role of the detective themselves, whether they are an instrument of the established order, and that means who is normatively human, or they are perceived as some kind of outsider that can sort of position themselves differently in terms of the grand narratives of the nation, the state, the judicial system, you know.
Just add, for example, in this Malkovich's performance of Poirot, this otherness is precisely emphasized. You have the old Poirot, the Poirot no one cares about, completely different from the canonical Poirot that we know of by David Suchet.
Probably the choice of the actor himself is not you know, ingenious. It has been chosen because he's sort of he's not really a part of the establishment. He's always played extra.
Maybe more vulnerable.
Yeah, yeah.
Are there other questions? Okay, I might have one actually.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, of course, do.
This is from Mike and has to do with Ceuta. I want to comment on some of the pictures that Mike brought, which are so troubling. Both of them are problematic. Both of them coming from the nation state of Spain. Luna has become a sort of hero, the savior, rescuer, comforting. You know, the fact that she's a young female plays a major role here as a comforting agent for the grieving migrant who's lost someone very dear to him in the crossing. But I'm not sure this is known outside of Spain, but she was the object of vicious attacks. You know this, right? Okay, fine. So I just wanted to... I'm sorry? Yes, she was, I mean, I don't know if you know what the political panorama right now in Spain is, but we have a very strong right-wing party known as Vox. They are a fascist party. They have now like 50 members of parliament in the national parliament, and they are really savvy about using social networks. And so they launched a terrible attack against Luna, calling her a whore, and accusing the migrant of sexual assault. Okay. The attack was so vicious that she closed all her social network profiles for a while and couldn't be reached at all because she, yeah. So she struggled. She really struggled. So it's an image that is so complicated for me, perhaps because I'm very close to that. I live in the south of Spain, so we get boats every single week, if not day. You know? And I'm very close to that. And when I see that picture, I'm so overwhelmed by contradictory feelings. So anyway, I shouldn't talk more about that. I'll leave that to the experts. Yeah. Other experts who are less close than me.
Laurence?
Thank you for the three papers, the three talks. I had a question for all three of you, which had to do with I'm trained as a historian rather than, and I was interested by your three papers. The first one with this non-fiction in the title, you know, for Corinne. Pilar's paper that I'm quoting you used this expression, the thin layer of fiction and disengagement on topical issues, and Mike's paper, which also focused on, with the illustration you all used in the pictures. And I was wondering if these authors have, during interviews, specifically sort of commented on their fictional work, saying that they wanted to sort of take part in this debate, which I like this expression, this global economy of fear, of this globalization of, you know, the wasted bodies. And I was wondering if they had sort of a political stance in terms of the issues that you all focused on. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurence. Do you want to take it up, Corinne, about Danticat?
Well, Danticat uses different forms of writing, not just Danticat writes, uses different genres. She uses fiction, novels, short stories, but she also uses non-fiction, personal essays, and memoirs as well. So she's very versatile in her way of writing, and I don't know if, well, she is a committed writer to some extent. So she would write differently. Plus, the thing is that she's not only writing about Haitian people, but at times she's writing about her personal experience. And, as talking about her family and how some of them were victims of that, like her uncle. But she is also involved in organizations, for the defense of migrants. So there's a political implication on a daily basis. So I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Pilar, do you want to take it up for?
For Kang?
For Kang.
I see Kang as doing something that she couldn't do as an international human rights scholar, academic, and so on. I think she is using the crime genre as a sort of counter-discourse against anti-Islamic propaganda after 9/11, and I think that is very consistent throughout all of her novels. The choice of this man as a detective who is a practicing Muslim, who's deeply religious. He has a deep religiosity, and at the same time working within a secular state, and also because the form tends to criminalize the other, tends to criminalize migrants, refugees, and so on. And so I think what I'm interested in is really why she chose crime fiction. She also writes fantasy, and that's like my next step. I want to have a look and see what she's doing in fantasy, because I think that in general, when you read a book, you want it to be realistic. Or when we watch a film, like yesterday's question about the film, I wanted to know how realistic this was, how this fitted with the kind of community in Corsica. I think we tend to look at realistic pieces of art in our search for answers or explanations of our reality. But there might be really fascinating proposals from other kinds of art, or other artistic manifestations. So that's why I'm looking at crime genre or fantasy.
Mike, do you want to take up this question that has to do with, writing and political commitment?
I think Ghosh is very conscious of what he's doing with this novel. He had a nonfiction publication in 2017 called The Great Derangement, which is focusing on climate change. And kind of the focus of this novel is increasing migration because of climate change. So he's very conscious of that. Some of the images he's putting in the novel are very contemporary. And the whole book on Island is very improbable. It's almost like fantasy. And this is kind of part of what he argues in The Great Derangement, is that realism has made us all complicit in the deterioration of the environment, and he's making an improbable novel is the only type of solution toward that.
Is there another question? Alan?
Hi, thank you for these papers. I had I was going to read a short passage, really, that inspired by what Michael's talking about in terms of bodies in the water, and really it's to make the analogy again with slavery and the ways in which these bodies are replicating in similar ways. And I was going to read from it's very short, but I was going to read from Lubena Himid talking about her work Memorial to Zong, which is from 1991. But she actually talked about this to me in 2002-03 in interviews I did with her. and she talks about waste. And again, this links to Saidiya Hartman's work, Lose Your Mother, and the way in which she talks about waste as well. And I just sort of think that the quotation you used was really interesting from Puglisi, but it needs to be put into other contexts, I think, in order to make it work. So I'll just read the quote. I'm trying to talk about the waste, she told me, the waste of creativity, the excuses that we use for throwing people overboard that they were too ill to waste water on. I'm trying to talk of that vast expanse of water between yesterday and tomorrow, Africa and the New World. And I'm trying to talk also about where all those people are now in the water. They are the body of the water now. They are it. So I don't want, what I'm trying to say is that, in fact, these ideas are present not only in migrant discourse, but also in the discourse around slavery. And the discourse around slavery kind of predates the discourse around migration. And I think it's really important to kind of acknowledge this in those terms. And Puglisi's work is really important, but there's a sense in which it's prefigured and postfigured by Hartman in different ways in talking about the waste in those slave forts in Lose Your Mother outside. So I was just wondering if you're conceptualizing this these similarities. Thank you.
Thank you. I think absolutely. I mean, even in Gun Island, Ghosh brings up Turner's painting of the Zong. He's tracing back to 1500 to contemporary migration. Sometimes I feel like the analogy between slavery and migration isn't the greatest analogy because it strips all agency from migrants fleeing. So I think it's complicated for me for when I'm thinking through current migration and then trying to map it on top of slavery. I think the conditions, imperialism, colonialism is causing the movement, but I think they're also very different. Kidnapping, stealing people from their land and shipping them across the Middle Passage is different than migrants, fleeing, choosing to leave. So it worries me about only seeing migrants as victims all the time, that there's agency in flight.
Yeah, I suppose I think that's very true. I suppose I'm thinking about the ways in which you talk about that folk talk about waste, and yeah, I just thought that was something that maybe can enable us to think about comparisons as well as differences. And I think we always have to think about comparisons and differences.
I was speaking with a colleague of mine yesterday, and he was bringing up, Glissant's notion of the balls and the chains, along the bottom of the ocean as these constant reminders of kind of waste that's sitting there, but also has some type of development within it, like the algae growing on it.
Yeah, and I suppose Glissant's idea of that links to Drexciya and the kind of idea of that kind of science fictional idea of survival in the water. So I don't know if people know about Drexciya, but if you look at the work of Ellen Gallagher, the painter, she has people living under the water who are those discarded bodies. So kind of, a kind of idea of survival, despite, but obviously utopian, but there are kind of ways of sort of thinking about life beyond that waste in the water, even if they are fictional and utopian and etc., which are kind of ways that black artists have of kind of trying to think through their survival, so as artists in a sense, that the legacy is those deaths in the water, but the legacy is also those who survive too.
Yeah, may I add something, Alan, to what you're saying, which would be in a similar vein, but thinking about literary intertextuality, which means that some of the things that I read now make me think about obviously Beloved, the passage, and so since these are, as you're saying, artists, writers, I mean, they write with what has been written before them. Obviously, they bring it somewhere else, maybe, but you do have, and at times our work as literary analysts is precisely to draw all these connections and to see, you know, the creativity and the ways in which they address a current situation in light of, you know, precisely, you know, when I think of Morrison and the intertextuality, I think about that. I think about how she had to address it from her perspective about, you know, being a black woman writer, African American, thinking about the legacy of slavery in the United States and you know, the ways in which you're talking about these works where there is obviously, you know, if I can say that like that, as some sort of displacement. But in terms of literary imagination and intertextuality, you do have these other texts that they might refer to explicitly or not explicitly, but they are out there. And representations, you know, we were talking about Zong. I mean, Zong is really intertextual in the sense that you have, you know, the painting and etc. But you have a wording. I mean, from Zong at times, you know, some of the wording could be placed almost, you know, on top of Morrison, and you know, it's really uncanny, and some of it for the reader. You know, my question would have been about the reader, because you addressed it. Obviously, with crime novel, the reader is created by the genre, and so I think that, you know, maybe my question to the three of you would be, you know, the kind of reader that is created precisely since you're talking about transformation. You know, something that is political. You know, is the crime novel something that deflects somehow, or, you know, can it be redirected? Is, you know, Danticat's sensitivity some, you know, really more, is it going to be more in tune and directed towards a reader that is going to be to be responsive to what she writes? And I don't know Ghosh, but I mean, it's the same kind of question. You know, the kind of reader that is created in the different types of writings that you are addressing. I don't know, who wants to take it up? Do you want,
The other side.
yeah, Mike, do you want to take it up?
I'm thinking through it still. I mean, I think Ghosh, especially with this novel, is trying to make the reader recognize complicity in environmental change and migration. He works intertextual with his own text. The Ibis trilogy he's referring back to several times. So he's tracing, like, their other deaths and other novels are talked about in this novel, you know, like it's its own clustered reality almost. So he expects a lot from the reader, but I think he's aiming toward recognizing, you know, that there's some form of complicity, especially with his more recent push toward looking at the environment and environmental change, which will cause mass migration more in the future.
Well, I don't really know who she has in mind when she writes her stories. I guess or her works, I guess she addresses American readers, but an international readership. Besides, some of her short stories have been translated into Creole and tapes. So, especially Crick Crack. Well, I mean, Crick Crack. Yes, all of her works have been translated into many languages. But you know, what I was trying to say is that she's not only addressing Western readers, she is also addressing, in an indirect way, her own community as well. You know, Haitians and living in the U.S. You know, because she's a member of the diaspora, but also maybe people on the island.
Yeah, my question was more directed towards you, if I can be fair to, which is that, you know, crime fiction obviously is a popular genre.
It is very popular,
obviously, yeah. You're going to have, I mean, I haven't studied it in depth, but you also have an element, obviously,
Yes.
of closure and pleasure on the part of the reader, which is
Yes.
going to deflect from, especially the themes that you
Yeah.
that your author is dealing with.
Yes, yes, I'm very interested in the reception side of each genre or of literature in general. What does it make us feel? What kind of affects are raised? And I think I've tried to prove that Cannes is really a call for action and a call for reflection. I think she's trying to promote a kind of empathy that is targeting oneself first. There's a kind of self-critique. There's a critique of the Canadian state, which is a state that, in terms of migration policies, has a good reputation, like being a good agent, being receptive to migration and so on. But it's a lot more complex than that. Thank you.
I think Corinne wanted to say something.
Yes, she also writes for herself. It's liberating. There's a sort of a therapeutic dimension to it as well.
Yeah, especially, I was thinking about Haiti. Haiti, in some of the other writing, obviously, what is going to be emphasized is the Haitian Revolution, pride, etc. And what you have here is exactly the opposite. It's some sort of the defeat, the sort of a chaotic state of the island. Okay, we might want to close and have coffee. So thank you very much, and thank you to our speakers.